One, two, three. It's Friday. We need that count in. Welcome to the Creative City Show, Tucson, with me, your host, Zach Yenser. And this Friday edition, July 26th, as we close out the week, sharing the stories and strategies of the people and ideas shaping Tucson's future. And along the way, we envision, we debate, we discuss the issues and themes critical towards getting Tucson to its best possible future. A future that I believe is closer around the corner than we realize, and with a potential that is greater than we often give ourselves credit for. And I think my guest in studio in this first hour will probably agree, just based on what we've talked about in the past, that Tucson is in a tipping point moment. It's not our first one, it won't be our last one, but we have, I think, a 3 to 5 year period to make certain decisions in certain areas and to take a certain course that will, whatever decisions we make, really chart out the next 50 years. I really believe we're at that point in time. And so it makes these conversations all the more prevalent, all the more relevant, and we get to do it every day, Monday through Friday, 10 to 12, together, Tucson. The main way we do that is our live line, 790-2040. It's an opportunity to have a daily community conversation about the issues and the topics that mean the most to you and to me and matter the most. And that's what we're going to do as we close out this Friday with today's show. I'm looking forward to our 11 o'clock hour, where we'll talk about some cool Tucson things happening. I'm excited about the Nova Home Loan Bowl news. I'll share that in case it hasn't crossed your radar. Also, free streetcar rides. Whether or not you like the thing or you don't, if you've never tried it, make your way down because it's free. What do you have to lose? So I will mention that as well, and kind of some ways you can take that this weekend and see what you think for yourself. We did a deep dive on the streetcar a couple weeks ago with Amber Smith from the Tucson Metro Chamber of Commerce. And we're going to do a similar deep dive, though, in our 10 o'clock hour. I have across from me in studio Supervisor Ramon Valadez, representing Pima County District 2. And I asked him to come in and to demystify and to discuss and talk about the news of the week, and that is, of course, the issue around the moving of the migrant services that CCS has been holding at the Benedictine Monastery to an unused wing of the Pima County Juvenile Detention Center. And of what little I know, it's a fraction of what Supervisor Valadez knows. I just think there's a lot of misinformation. And you don't have to agree with the decision. You don't have to like it. In fact, the board was kind of split. But at least let's get the information right and go from there. And in my opinion, the information swirling around on the interwebs has not been correct. So let's get it correct, or let's at least try, and then go from there. So that's hour one, 790-2040. And we are going to get started with Ramon Valadez. Ramon, thank you for being in studio. I appreciate your time.
Zach, absolutely. Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to really talk about some important issues to the community.
And we're going to do a classic Creative City show on this today. I used to be able to say you can't see it, but actually you can. We are on YouTube Live. So if you go to kvoi.com and just go to kvoi.com, there's now a new tab. It's called the Watch tab. You can click on that. You can see this conversation live. And that popped up for me because what you can now see is a stack of Chuck Huckleberry memos and information here. And we're going to go a little wonky, not too heavy. I had a caller call in, Ramon, and said, boy, I need a continuing education credit after XYZ guest. We're not going to go that wonky, but I want to do from a beginning to end, what are we actually dealing with here, and why was this decision made? And so the information is in front. You're here, Ramon. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Zach. I appreciate the opportunity.
So I want to go way back to start, way back. When we talk about these migrant families that are going through the asylum process, I'm going to go way back even before Benedictine. Mm-hmm. Who are we talking about? Who are these families? How did they get here? And why are these services in Tucson necessary as opposed to what's happening at our ports of entry and at our border?
Well, what we've seen over the this time span here is that typically when we're talking about immigrants, we're talking about the immigrants coming either through the border with documentation or across the border without documentation. What we've seen because of whatever conditions are happening in these Central American countries of Guatemala, El Salvador, and today we're even seeing immigrants coming from as far south as Brazil, is they're coming to the U.S. Through Mexico, oftentimes in very questionable conditions, which a lot of these are families with young children. So if you really think about if you're a parent, think about how difficult life has to be that you're going to walk through Mexico to get to the U.S. in often dangerous, if not perilous conditions to get here. We're talking to a great degree when we're talking about asylum seekers, we're talking about Central Americans and, like as I said, now even South Americans. And what we're seeing is twofold. There are those that are waiting at the border to claim asylum and then come across to wait for their legal proceedings to happen, as well as some are being picked up already on U.S. soils by ICE and Border Patrol, and then they go through a process as well, and then they come here. So what we started seeing, and a lot of people think that the county is the lead agency in this whole thing, and in truth, the lead agency is the faith community.
Right.
The faith community, a big shout out to the faith community in Tucson and Pima County, and thank you for all of your efforts for the entire faith community, and obviously CCS gets a part of that as well.
Catholic Community Services.
Right.
Yeah.
And obviously in January, what we saw is the owner of the Benedictine Monastery offered up the Benedictine Monastery until the end of this month. And so big shout out and thanks to them as well. Yeah.
Yep.
Absolutely, because they stepped up as well.
And was that city-led or county? Was this county a part of the Benedictine decision, or is that more city and now it's transferring to county in terms of the jurisdiction?
What has happened is it was actually led by neither. It was led by Catholic Community Services, although Councilmember Kasachek has been integral, and my hat's off to the Councilmember Kasachek, because he not only talked the talk on that when he walked the walk at one point around the Easter holiday, when we had over 1,000 of our visitors in our community. He closed his office so that they could have another place to stay in. At that point, in our community we had about 1,000. But at that point, the city had to open up a shelter. The county had to open up a shelter. The faith community stepped up, and they handled about 200 additional. And between the county, the city, and CCS, took care of about 800 of them. So it's been an ongoing problem, or an ongoing issue. I'm sorry. Going forward, and as long as ICE and Border Patrol have this policy of dropping off these immigrants, because obviously the choice there is to drop them off at a Greyhound parking lot with no resources, with no ticket, with no guidance, and that just is neither safe for the immigrant nor for the community when we're talking about this level of numbers. And so Catholic Community Services and the faith community have worked with Border Patrol to arrange to have them dropped off at this point at the Benedictine Monastery, and going forward until there's a better alternative at the juvenile facility on Ajo Way.
And there has been pretty broad consensus, and we're going to get to that decision-making process. We're going to get to the community input that was or wasn't in place, and that's been a huge point of contention. We're going to get to all those details, but backing up, there has been pretty broad consensus, whether it's Sheriff Napier, whether I think to a large degree, Supervisors Christie and Miller. There's been broad police backing, council backing. Really, there seems to be a broad support that dropping these families off at the Greyhound station is not the right way to go. That somehow, some way, the right decision at a local jurisdiction level is to make sure that these families are housed in an appropriate way. And by the way, when we mean housed, we're not talking the 45, 60-day level we're looking at the border. We're talking about a 1 to 3 day turnaround. Correct, Supervisor Valadez?
Typically, it is a 1 to 3 day, and the average is about a little over 2 days. And because remember, what they're doing when they show up at the Benedictine Monastery, for example, is they go through and they're actually going to have a bed to sleep in that night. They have, unfortunately, because of the state of the Benedictine Monastery, it has some very serious plumbing issues, so there's no indoor plumbing to really speak of, so that they've had porta potties on the outside, which are no joy when it's 90 or 100 degrees, but that's what we've had to work with at this point. They've also had an outdoor shower, which is essentially a hose that's hooked up outside in a loading bay. But typically, it takes 1 to 3 days to process and get them going safely. There are medical volunteers, the medical personnel that actually volunteer to do an initial screening, and obviously if there are other serious issues, because remember, oftentimes these families are leaving and they're walking a month or more to get here. So there may be some issues that they're looking after, and so by the time they actually have their ticket and leave, whether it's flying out or on a Greyhound bus, what we also have to consider is a lot of these families that are coming neither speak English nor Spanish. A lot of them speak a dialect of Mayan. So that's been a logistical issue as well. So oftentimes when they're leaving, what I saw when I visited the Benedictine Monastery earlier this week is that all their instructions are translated to their dialect in Mayan, so that they understand where to go, and then they're given a sheet of paper that's written in English, so if they happen to get lost at a Greyhound station, they can show it to somebody, and somebody can help them. And there's some rudimentary level of communication going on.
I think, and I want to keep forecasting for our listeners, because I know our listeners on both sides of the issue. It's really been interesting. Probably, I mean, it's interesting to me. It's got to be fascinating to you in your position to see that that in some cases the board was in the middle of an issue where both sides had an issue with how this went down. So we're going to get into those themes, and some of those themes need demystified. Again, you've got about a 1-inch thick stack of memos from the supervisor or from the administrator. But we'll probably end up getting there right about 10:25 or so as we head into our second segment. But I want to ask one or two more kind of setup questions.
Sure.
One of the things I've heard out in the community, at least the perception, and I think in public policy, perception is as close to reality as it gets, is I've heard said, look, the city knew that the Benedictine Monastery was a limited opportunity, and they knew when it was going to end. The Board of Supervisors knew that it was a limited opportunity, it was going to end. Catholic Community Services knew it was a limited opportunity, and it was going to end. And it feels like a fire drill where all of a sudden everyone looked up and went, oh my goodness, we have a month to go, we got to figure out a solution, and it feels rushed. It felt like it was crisis management. Supervisor, I like having you on because you don't believe in the politician safe space movement. That when you signed up for this gig, you signed up to get asked questions. 790-2040 is our audience's opportunity. The question I want to ask is that correct perception? Is that what happened or no?
No. What had happened is, as I said earlier, the owners of the Benedictine Monastery have been very generous and allowed the usage for that sanctuary here, or that safe space here. But ever since the CCS and the other faith-based efforts went into that facility, there was also a separate effort looking for a more permanent facility. In part because what happens, think about this, a convent, which actually the monastery is a convent.
Correct.
Is not intended for the volume of usage of essentially a commercial facility,
Yep.
which is what it's being used for right now. So it was degrading as it was continued to being used, and obviously that accounts for some of the issues that were had. So ever since they moved in, CCS and working with partners in the community, has been looking at multiple locations. I believe they looked at over 35 sites in the community. They looked at warehouses. They looked at the Children's Association in South Tucson. They looked at Hohokam School and a number of sites. And a lot of people are trying to, hey, let's go do this. Let's go look over here. And obviously we saw that at the last moment with Menlo Elementary and with Howenstein.
And you better know I was on the phone with the powers that be and went, hey, my neighborhood was mentioned. What's going on here? I actually got emails from neighbors going, wait a second, I'm hearing from little birdies and through the grapevine. Anyway, that one was, I was very involved in that one. So
yeah, and obviously we can talk a little bit more about that as soon as we're done with the question. But when we looked at, and it's not us that was making the decision, it was Catholic Community Services as the lead agency. They were looking for the following criteria, and I had them put it in writing for me so I could share with our listeners. They were looking for a large enough facility that was safe, sanitary overnight quarters initially for at least 200 people with a potential to increase for 300 assisted on a daily basis, a capacity for at least 50 volunteers per shift providing humanitarian aid and travel processing, an immediate availability and good condition, not requiring excessive remodeling or rehabilitation, and affordable lease terms for at least a year while this DHS intends to continue to release asylum seekers in the Pima County region, as well as, and this was very important too, a centralized location so that volunteers could come more easily, as well as be centralized between the Greyhound Park and the airport so that our guests could get on a plane or a Greyhound to get to their final destination. So those are the criteria that were being looked at, and oftentimes they were getting a lot of suggestions from a lot of different people, a lot of which didn't meet these criteria. And that was part of the issue. If you think about what I told you in terms just of the translation, I mean, there are over, I believe, 15 dialects of Mayan that these guests speak. And when we were talking about this issue at the Board of Supervisors on Monday, we had one of the translators from the Guatemalan consulate here in Tucson really kind of talk about that it's a lot easier for him to serve a lot more people if there's a centralized location, because he can go there and just help every family that he can get to. And if he has to keep getting in the car in between locations to do it, it limits a lot of his ability and time to be able to help more people. So, I know there's a rumor that thinks we just started looking, or the CCS just started looking a month ago, but in truth, they've been looking ever since they moved into the Benedictine monastery, and probably before that. It was really the criteria that they were looking for that made it really difficult. And I know they looked at a number of warehouses as well, but that became problematic as it wasn't really built out to handle this.
Well, one of the things, maybe just to get your clarification on before we go to our break, is when you say centralization, there's a geographic component to that, but it sounded like there was also a second definition of that, and that was there was a proposal to actually divvy up this large group or this need for a large group into churches and kind of a decentralized kind of a multiple venues of spaces. And is it true then that was that a CCS decision of that wasn't optimal? Was that a Pima County decision?
No, and the criteria put together by Catholic Community Services, but I will also tell you that this is not just a Catholic Community Services effort. It really, that's why when we opened up, I thanked the entire faith-based community in Tucson and Pima County, because the entire faith-based community has at some point in time or all along been involved in the effort. So big shout out and thanks and gratitude goes out to all of them. And you're right. Thank you for catching the differentiation of the two words. Yes, they were looking for one location where they could be served, because if you're looking at medical services, translation services, legal services, transportation services, it makes it easier for. Remember, the people that are helping typically tend to be volunteers, and to expect them to, as volunteers, go to 10 different locations to try and help people is really more effectively, and on a practical perspective, is going to limit the amount of people they're going to be able to help, bottom line. But they were also looking for a centralized location geographically, so that they have over 50 people, volunteers, that will actually drive our visitors to either the airport or to Greyhound, or in some cases to Phoenix for transportation needs as well. So it becomes easier if it's in a location that's easy to access, that has easy access and equal access to those. When one of the things, in addition to the physical state of Hohokam, that I know that caused them to check it off the list, was that so really far away from the airport. It's really far away from Greyhound Park, and frankly, it's not that easy to get to. So, thank you for asking me to clarify that, because that's absolutely right.
Yeah, and a lot of this, if you're listening, Tucson, are I feel like it's kind of it's a fun privilege on this side of the mic to relay what I hear and to relay the concerns that I hear. And so, Tucson, if you're listening and you've been following this story, you have a question, you have a thought, 790-2040 is your live line opportunity. We're going to go to a break, but when we come back, we've kind of set, I think, the stage. We've said who these families are, the Benedictine monastery connection, some of the decision criteria, and how we've gotten at least part way how the juvenile detention center was the best option, certainly in the view of Catholic Community Services, and as was backed up on Monday by a 3-2 vote of the Pima County Board of Supervisors. We're going to get into that too with Supervisor Ramon Valadez, representing District 2, when we come back from the break. And I'll ask some community questions that I've received, even in real time, as having this conversation. So I'm looking forward to that. Tucson, don't go away. We are just partway through our deep dive into what has been a contentious issue. We're looking at the facts. We're taking into account the emotional responses, and we're kind of wading through all of it here on the show. It's what we do. Don't go away. 1030 The Voice, trusted local news and talk. Tucson, welcome back to today's program, Friday, July 26th, with me, your host, Zach Yenser, as we are doing a deep dive on the recent decision this week to finalize the movement of the migrant shelter from the Benedictine Monastery to an unused wing of the Pima County Juvenile Detention Center. And we're having that conversation with Supervisor Ramon Valadez, representing District 2 on the Pima County Board of Supervisors. And this is your opportunity to call in with your questions or concerns or thoughts. 790-2040. We are not on this hour trying to convince of any of the sides of this issue. I think we're plainly just trying to make sure that we have on the table, here's what happened, here are the facts, and then we can agree or disagree from those. But that is substantially better than agreeing or disagreeing on misfacts, at least in my view. Maybe this is just my issue, Ramon Valadez. Maybe it just bugs me. I don't know.
Bugs me too.
So I've got a couple of community questions to ask you that I think will set up this segment.
Okay.
And it gets back to, just to review, I think a lot of the narrative around this issue is that Pima County was the primary negotiator and decision maker. And in fact, at least as you've explained it, Catholic Community Services was the real driver and the real criteria setter of this decision. And I received a question from someone who's pretty involved in the community, wondering, it seemed to them that there was work on this between Pima County and Catholic Community Services prior to community input. And then there was kind of okay, we'll get community input. And you mentioned you got a lot of ideas. And then there was this feeling that that community input was ignored, and then it went to a vote. Again, just straightforward. Is that how it happened, or what are some of the nuances that you're able to speak to that either confirm part of that or clarify part of that?
In part, there's multiple parts on that one. Let me see if I can cover them all, or as many of them as I can cover. First of all, that it was Catholic Community Service working with community partners. As I said, many of the faith-based communities in our community working together, looking for different locations. But it was really clear that those criteria were important and needed to be fulfilled. There was a request that should be on the website under the county administrator's memos that should have a copy of the letter from Bishop Weisenberger asking for the usage of the Juvenile Detention Center as a replacement for the Benedictine Monastery. Part of that discussion is that a lot of people, to their credit, were trying to come up with really better ideas. And as I said, to their credit. And so we're just that kind of community. Unfortunately, a lot of them didn't have the benefit of understanding the need of those criteria that we went over a little while ago. And if you need me to, I can go through them again in just a little bit. So when they were suggesting a place, it wasn't big enough, or it didn't meet the criteria. And a lot of places would end up having, they would require major retrofit, and they have to be out of the Benedictine Monastery by August 6th. And a major retrofit, you're talking at least months. So what were we going to do with the immigrants that were coming in during that period of time? So at one point in time after that request was made, we looked at obviously juvenile. I've been the juvenile since that request has been made, because I wanted to make sure, from my perspective, I went with county administration, including the administrator, and one of the criteria that I told them was that I needed to feel certain that families that were there were going to feel safe and welcome. Because that was going to be a big deal for me. I didn't want it to, if kids were playing, that they had an ability to hurt themselves accidentally. So we needed to make sure that those issues were dealt with, and obviously change the environment as much as we could from a detention center. I mean, obviously this community has a background of using different facilities for different usages. I mean, the old Mother Higgins was converted to a juvenile detention center, and then was converted to the Teresa Lee Health Clinic over on Cushing before it moved over to west of the freeway. So we've done these kinds of things before historically. But in truth, we had a meeting about a week, last week with the bishop and a number of organizations, and some of them expressed concern that they weren't, at that point, they didn't feel we were listening to them, that they didn't want to have it at the juvenile facility. And hey, I understand. But at this point, we're dealing with a August 6th move-out date where we're not going to have a place where these visitors to our community are going to be able to feel safe, comfortable, and welcome. So part of the comments, if you may have listened to the board meeting, we tried to be as clear as possible that, look, right now we are in a position where we need a facility. That's going to be juvenile facility on Ajo beginning in August. If the faith-based community or other organizations or the community itself comes together and we can find an alternative, a better alternative that meets these criterias, you know, the lease calls for a 30-day cancellation, but I'll tell you what, we'll cancel it the day up. The important thing for those of us on the board and the county is really that we have a place that's safe and comfortable. I'll tell you what, when I went to the Benedictine Monastery, I think I went on Tuesday, it was hot outside, and we're in monsoon season, so it was humid. I will tell you that a porta potty outdoors in the sun is probably one of the last places I would want to be, even when I needed to use the restroom. And then when I looked at the shower, it was really just a PVC rectangular cube that had a hose going onto it with a valve. You know, that's a little better, particularly if it's a little hot because you can cool off. But I looked inside. You know what? It's probably a decent place considering where it is. They've been for the last 1 to 2 months in terms of walking through to get here. But in truth, the juvenile center has private showers. Think about this. Each of the rooms have their own toilet. They have a lot more privacy than they've had in a really long time. But again, and this is what I tried to make as clear as possible in my comments during the vote, was if we as a community can come up with a better place, we'll close it down. We don't have a problem with that. The issue for us is making sure we had a safe and comfortable place to serve our guests, period. If we find a better one, we'll gladly shut it down.
Another thing I've heard out there in the community for you to either clarify somehow, is, and this relates to another question I received I want to ask you, is what I haven't heard also talked about, is that if CCS was not to partner with a facility that Pima County could support, that CCS would have to bear more of the cost than I've heard that they may be willing to bear, that they wanted a partner that could help with the cost. I did receive, we'll probably get to it in our third segment, a question about cost and what are the reasons why taxpayers should be supportive of this. Was that an issue on the table? Is that something that is a valid piece of this?
Well, part of, I guess it's related to the last minute review of the two schools, one being Menlo, the other one being Howenstein.
This is where that came up for me, was it the last minute review of two TUSD schools.
And just so the people understand, what happened is that the leasee at Menlo informed TUSD that they were not going to renew their lease come the end of that lease. And so obviously that there was a request from one of my colleagues to have CCS and the county take a look at that facility. What wasn't clear at that point was that the facility itself in its entirety wasn't going to be available because the leasee or the lease did not end until December of this year. Plus, it's an elementary school, so obviously the volume of usage, particularly in terms of the waste and sewer and water, were going to be much greater than what the facility itself was designed for in terms of its infrastructure.
I was there last night. It's small.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then if you take a look at Howenstein, to my understanding, hasn't been inhabited or hasn't had people inside of it for about 6 years, a little bit more than 6 years. And from what I was told from CCS, it would require substantial renovation and rehab that was not going to be able to be done anywhere near the August 6th date. So part of the issue that's come up is people think that some people thought that we could actually spend money at Howenstein or at any of these facilities. The way the county is paying for it is two ways. Part of it is, if you remember when the 3 votes that passed Stone Garden earlier this year on the board, they included a provision to include usage of Stone Garden monies for humanitarian efforts. So part of the rehab that's being, or the renovations that are being done at Juvenile, and some of the operational costs are being offset through some of that humanitarian aid. And right now it's still in the process to try and get it done. And Sheriff Napier has been helpful in trying to advocate for that. In addition to that, the way that we are also paying for it is we're applying for a number of federal grants that are site-specific. So the site is Juvenile. Now, if it was a TUSD school, the appropriate entity to apply for those federal grants would not be the county, it would be TUSD. Part of the issue there is simply people thought we were going to spend several $100,000 on not Howenstein, Hohokam, when that was never on the table. It's a TUSD facility. We can't do it as a TUSD facility. But TUSD would have had that option of applying for then those federal grants that are site-specific as well. So it wasn't capricious. It was simply the grant is site-specific that we're applying for. And there's several of them. So ultimately, we believe that while initially local monies are being fronted, that we can recover those through a number of federal grants. And obviously San Diego's run across a similar problem, and they actually are suing DHS to recoup their county taxpayers' costs as well.
Interesting. And I think our last segment will at least start with some of the funding questions and talk about Monday's proceedings, and this will catch us up to the end. We're with Supervisor Ramon Valadez from District 2 doing a deep dive today on the issues surrounding the Pima County Juvenile Detention Center as a place to process migrant families seeking the asylum process over a 1 to 3 day period in processing. We have Ingrid on our live line. Ingrid, thanks for calling in. Do you have a question for the supervisor?
Well, actually, it's probably more of a bunch of comments. These folks are coming from countries where they're not happy. They claim poverty, and yet they have big families. It doesn't stop them. They somehow managed to get all the way through Central America. I don't know on what. Where's the money coming from? Then they come here, and they're treated as if they stood in line like all the people from the rest of the world, people in Europe, Asia, and so forth, Africa. They're not waiting in line. They think that they're entitled to come here, and there are people here who are more than happy to have them. As a matter of fact, you may not know, but I've said it before, at a lecture at the University of Arizona's Duval Auditorium, a person actually who's lecturing said, it's our intention to Hispanize the entire Western Hemisphere. Well, I think that this is really part of the plot. Now, where is the United Nations? Why isn't the United Nations in there helping out? Why aren't people checking to see what in the world is going on and improve the conditions over there? That's pretty much why I called.
Ingrid, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your call. Supervisor Valadez, anything there that you can speak to from your position?
You know, I would tell you that maybe Ingrid has a point in terms of the United Nations involvement in some of these countries where the conditions have gotten to the point where families are coming through perilous conditions to get here. I will also tell you, however, that right now our immigration system is broken. Period. Exclamation point. End of story. And Washington, regardless of who's in charge, has failed to address the issue. The reason we as a community are looking at are having to deal, and not just us, all the border communities in the southwest border are having to deal with the issues we're having to deal with, is because Washington has failed. They have failed to address the immigration issue, which is, I understand, complicated, but constitutionally they're the only ones that can. So I probably wouldn't, or I probably would agree with Ingrid saying that the UN probably has a role to play in those Central American countries in terms of trying to make it or help people feel safe in their home country. But I would also argue that Washington has a huge role that they are simply punting on over and over and over again, and now they're causing these problems in border communities like ours.
It's interesting. We're going to get to Frank here before we go, our next caller, before we go to a break. But it's interesting because I think through administration change, there's been less humanitarian aid south of the border, because this has been a strategy on the table for the U.S. government to do exactly what Ingrid was mentioning for the UN to do, and that is to focus on some of the more foundational problems. That seems to be less of a strategy in this administration. So that's interesting. Let's go to Frank on our live line to wrap up our segment. Frank, thanks for calling in. What's on your mind today?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, why don't they go through this same effort for all the homeless people on Tucson Street? You know, they don't seem to do much for them, but for all the illegals that come through, they do everything possible.
Frank,
and more.
Sorry there, I didn't mean to cut you off, Frank. Thanks for your question. Supervisor Valadez, a thought on that?
I will tell you that's actually come across over and over and over. And I'll tell you what, we do have we do a good amount of help for our homeless population. We actually, if someone does have someone who wants to get help and who is homeless today, they can feel free to call my office at 724-8126, and we'll be happy to direct them. But the county also has the Jackson Sullivan Employment Center, which is intended, has a program specifically for homeless to try and help them transition from being homeless to having a roof over their head, clothes on their back, and to being gainfully employed. In addition to some of the other programs, we have a lot through our what used to be our workforce investment program, as well as some of our housing programs.
You know, Supervisor, this is going to be the point of the next segment, and I think what the callers that we've heard are getting to is why is there a feeling that there is either a reason or a mandate for the taxpayer to foot this? And Part B, we'll get into this as we go to break now. Part B is there is, for example, Supervisor Ali Miller feels like the Stone Garden and federal grant funding is a gamble. That, as you said, that the county is footing it, and we're hoping for. So there's some different views on the board. I want to get into that and talk about the taxpayer role in this and why it does or doesn't make sense in your mind. And that's how we'll end up, because I think that's the brass tacks of our conversation today. And we're hearing it from the community is why should the taxpayer contribute to this? And this over our homeless population. I really want to get into this. I think it's a great line of questioning. And Supervisor Ramon Valadez, representing District 2, is here in studio for us to do that today. We'll be right back after the break to wrap up this hour. You're on 1030 The Voice, trusted local news and talk. Tucson, welcome back to the program. We have 9 minutes left of this hour, this deep dive hour with Supervisor Ramon Valadez, representing District 2 on the Board of Supervisors. We're talking about the decision earlier in the week to move forward with moving the migrant family asylum process from the Benedictine Monastery to an unused wing of the Pima County Juvenile Detention Center. And we've talked a lot of details about all leading up to this point where we are in this segment. So catch the podcast at kvoi.com/podcast, because if I do a recap, we're going to lose out on time, and we've got some really important questions that I will get yelled at if I don't ask. So I want to keep my head here on the on the show, but there have been those even commenting during this hour with you, either by phone or by message. You can email me, thecreativecityshow@gmail.com. That the bigger question is that it really isn't the business of the council on the city side, with the Benedictine Monastery and Councilman Kozaczek, or the supervisors to use any taxpayer money for this. That's the big question. What would you say to that?
You know what? When we say that, I think it's an initial reaction, and I totally understand that, because, I understand why people would feel that way. But we have to consider the alternative to that. The alternative to that was where we started and why this all became happened with the Benedictine Monastery, and the faith-based community stepped up and created a lot of this humanitarian aid. The alternative was that these visitors to our community were being dropped off at Greyhound Station parking lot. Period. We have to put in perspective, okay, they're in a community they don't know, in a country they don't know. They don't know how to communicate in English or Spanish in a lot of these cases, in a parking lot. I'm sure nothing bad can happen there. So it became a decision that I'm thankful for, as I've stated before, to our faith-based community for stepping up to really take care of these visitors, to make sure that they went through the process, that they were getting to a safe place. And a lot of these visitors end up going to the East Coast as their final destination. But the alternative there was, do you think, we have to ask ourselves, is it possible that these visitors are going to end up in a bad place? Is it possible that there are going to be crimes of opportunity because they don't have anything to eat and any clothes on their back, or they're creating a situation that the outcome of which is going to be really undesirable. So the issue, obviously, we've talked about the responsibility we've been on the fact that the immigration system in this country is broken, that Washington isn't addressing the issue or doing the job that we need them to be doing in regards to whether we want to talk about aid to these countries to make sure that they become viable, livable, and sustainable, but locally, whether or not it's safer for our community members as well as our visitors to just be dropped off with no direction, no money, or nothing at those Greyhound parks, or rather have them taken care of, move to our final destination, and continue along the legal process, which is asylum seeking.
Sheriff Napier and Police Chief Magnus seem to agree that this is better off the street than on the street, even if that means some taxpayer solutions. I think one last big question, and we've got about 3 minutes, is on the other hand, it sounds like Sheriff Napier also has a few remaining concerns about the using Stone Garden for, even if we get it. I think that's the broader concern, is this is being fronted by the taxpayer, in effect, hopefully, reimbursed, so to speak, by grants and Stone Garden. There's that piece. And then the last, I don't mean to stack this on, but I want to make sure this gets in. The other piece I've heard is, why is Pima County, charging $100 to CCS for this, footing the rest of the bill, when at least the county could be charging fair market value? I think we're going to end up closing with that question because we're just running out of time. But speak to the taxpayer on this, Supervisor Valadez.
And that's a question that you need to know that the board keeps asking, to make sure, hey, what kind of certainty do we have? Are we fairly certain that we can make sure that federal monies are being brought to bear on this? And ultimately, this is not an issue that is exclusive to Pima County. It's an issue faced by other communities, including San Diego, who at this point has sued DHS to recover their costs for doing this. This is a problem that was not caused. It was not caused or frankly contributed to by local communities. It's again a failure of Washington to address the real issues that would have prevented this from becoming an issue. So, in truth, I understand the concern. We've talked about the alternative is not a better alternative. Law enforcement, both in the form of the Chief Magnus and the sheriff, agree with that. But in truth, we are committed to recovering these costs from the federal government where the cost should be borne, as immigration and asylum seeking is a federal responsibility.
So is there any concern on your part? Do you share the concern of Sheriff Napier that even if Stone Garden funds can be used for this, that it jeopardizes future uses of the funding? Or you mentioned earlier, in case some of our listeners weren't here, is that Stone Garden was passed by a 3-2 vote earlier in the year to receive that funding with the ability to use it for humanitarian purposes. I just wanted to catch up any of our listeners who come in and out of our conversation with that. Do you share that concern that Stone Garden funding may be jeopardized if it's used in this one-time case for this purpose?
This is actually a new one for DHS and associated agencies because it hasn't been used for humanitarian aid. And in truth, we are really the precedent-setting community in doing this. I don't know that I share it, to be honest with you, because I think it makes, to a lot of people, obviously I voted against the Stone Garden funding acceptance earlier this year, but to I think a lot of people, it makes it at least these federal monies are being used to help people as opposed to other operations. So I think it may actually make it more sellable.
In both directions, to federal,
Right.
to the federal government for continued funding, and to the board for continued acceptance. Is that what you're saying?
And think about this: when it was originally set up, the Investigator General of DHS did a report, I think 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, where it basically said that there wasn't really enough structure in the Stone Garden program of what it could and couldn't be used for, and that was one of the problems with the funding itself. So it's got some associated problems that I think have never been addressed, and I think this at least gives it some level of structure and credibility.
Supervisor Valadez, thank you for coming on the show and getting into detail. I think we covered a lot of ground. I think we covered a lot of policy. I at least hope our listeners feel as well that we went past the talking points to actually talk about the points, if you will. Tucson, we've got another hour together. We'll take your calls on this through next hour. We'd love to hear what you're thinking. You can listen to the podcast at either iTunes, Google Play Music, or kvoi.com/podcast. I encourage you that you do. Once again, Supervisor Valadez, thank you for your generous time to go into this issue from beginning to end and answer some of the burning questions that I've seen and heard from the community on this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Zach, and they can feel free to call my office at 724-8126 if they'd like to ask some more questions.
Perfect. Thank you again. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, Zach.
Tucson, we'll be back in 5 after top of hour news to continue and wrap up this Friday's edition of the Creative City Show with me, your host, Zach Yenser. See you in a minute.